Test, there we go. So when I began to dawn on me that our paternal feast of John the Baptist was going to fall right at the same time as the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots in New York, which historians sort of use as the marker of the beginning of the gay liberation movement in this country, I began to think of that word, liberation, and how it's not owned by any one group or person, but that we all seek liberation in different ways, and how that was at the heart of John's ministry. For the sake of brevity, we didn't read the first scripture reading appointed for today from the book of Isaiah, but it's always associated with John and his ministry, because he saw himself as preparing a way in the desert for our God, for the realm of God. And that reading, many of you know, and you think of George Friedrich Handel when you hear it. It says that every valley will be exalted and every mountain and hill may be made low. And a lot of people complain to me that would be a boring earth if he didn't have the topography. That's not the point. The point is John wanted to create a level playing field for everyone. He wanted a road to God that would be accessible to everyone. And so in his teaching, he said, you know, if you have two coats, give it one to one who has none. That makes things level. And then I was immediately reminded of our great 20th century prophet, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had that wonderful quote of the arc of the moral universe is long, but it always bends towards justice. So I thought today might be a good time to look back, to celebrate, and also to be challenged by some of that bending of the moral arc towards justice in the last 50 years. And I'd like just to begin because in 1969, I was 12 years old. It was the summer that it was the spring I was confirmed. It was the summer that I first felt my call to the priesthood. And I had little idea at that moment that what was happening in New York City would have any personal effect on my life at all. Until 2 years later, when I was 14, and I realized that there was a word or words for the feelings I was having towards members of my own gender, and that none of them were good words. And I realized that what I was feeling, most people thought was sick, was perverted, and was evil. And so all of a sudden, my feeling of calling to be a priest seemed like out the window, because I was not worthy to be that. And at that time in our parish hall, we had a track rack. You know, we sort of have a track rack on our back walls back there, where forward movement publications get put, these little pamphlets. And I remember walking by once, and a pamphlet caught my eye. It was entitled, "Christian Words to a Homosexual." And my heart went up into my throat. And I thought, are there such things? and what might they say? I wanted so much to read that pamphlet. The only problem is I couldn't, because I was never in the parish hall when I wasn't with other people. And there was no way anyone was going to go see me take that pamphlet out of the rack. So, but I became obsessed with it. I couldn't stop looking at it every time I passed by. So I devised a wise scheme. One winter night, as our youth group met there, I came in and I took my gloves off and I put them in the windowsill by the track rack. And then the youth group meeting went on, and we got ready to leave, and we all went out, and the sponsors were getting ready to lock the door, and I said, oh, I forgot my gloves. Can I run back in and get them? So I ran in, I grabbed the gloves, and I reached over and grabbed the pamphlet and put it in my inside pocket. My heart was racing, and I was sitting in the car just not being able to wait to get home so I could read it. But then, feeling guilt. I had enough guilt at that time to go around, but I felt guilty because I knew you were supposed to put coins in. So I thought, in addition to everything else, I've now stolen. But you know, I always wish that I could thank the rector of that parish. He died when I was a freshman in college, before I had ever come out. And I'm sure in Richmond, Virginia, in the early 70s, he got some pushback for having that pamphlet in the tract rack. But he never knows the glimmer of hope that allowed me to keep going, because he took a small step to level the playing field. That's my story. But there are a lot of other stories to go around. So, Liz O'Callahan, where are you? Talk to us.
We're all thinking, why is Liz up here talking? And that's what I said to him. He asked me to come into his office the other day, and he said, Liz, I've been working on these liberation things. I said, well, Robert, I haven't been liberated from anything. And he goes, oh, yes, you have. And it made me stop and think, because in 1961, I was 69, I was 21 years old. I had been married for 2 years. I had grown up the Episcopal Church. I was a Sunday school teacher while I was high school. I was on Altar Guild from the time I was 8 years old. I helped with all sorts of things. I did all the things that women, girls could do in the church at that time. And I was married, and we were in the service, and we traveled around. We had children, and eventually settled down. And again, Altar Guild, Sunday school. And then eventually, while we were living in Eastern Washington in the 80s, I was asked to run for vestry and served on the vestry. And then I came here, and as you all know, I am very active in all sorts of things that in the 60s and before 69, I couldn't have done. I've been on the vestry, I've been the senior warden, I serve now behind the altar, I'm on the finance committee, all these things that I have always taken for granted. I never thought about not having the ability and the right to do those things, because I was blessed, I think, to have been born in a time when the world was already opening up to women, and I was at a place in a time when I wanted to do those things and they were available to me. And so now when I look back, I'm just stunned that I didn't think I was liberated, because it was always open to me. But that's not the case. Robert's story and other people's stories will tell you that, and I think we hear that story quite often from the younger generation, when they hear those of us in the older generation complained about never being able to become a priest if you were a woman, or any of these other things, because now it's available to them much more easily, and they don't appreciate what it took to get to the place we are now. And we still have further to go, but we've come so far, and it's, for some, it seems so easy.
Tracy Collins, would you speak to us? You need here, come over this way. We put this here just for you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Really bad with microphones. My participation is a little bit more academic. I am an academic, so that fits. I'm going to talk about Black America from 1969 to 2019. Okay. Hearing older African Americans, like my parents, talk about the late 1960s, in some ways it sounds like another world. The US is a very different place than it was in 1968, or is it? While some things have improved markedly for Black Americans in the past 50 years, we're still fighting for many of the same battles. We're still fighting many of the same battles. How far have we progressed since then? In some ways, we've barely budged as people. Poverty is common. Back then, 25 million Americans, or 13%, lived below the poverty level. In 2019, 43 million do. It's 12.7%. The current Black poverty level is 22%, close to 3 times that of whites. By race, financial security is still dramatically different. For every $100 in white family wealth, black families have an estimate $8. Black progress, in the 60s, 20% of households were headed by single women. Now that's as high as 72%. More black Americans are currently on government aid than they were in 1968. Close to 40% of African Americans are poor enough to qualify for welfare, housing assistance, and other government programs. And there are conservative thinkers that hold black people accountable for those problems. Media continues to report that the black underclass defines black America. So this continues to be the public view. Assumptions are that blacks live in public housing and that crime and welfare checks are main sources of income. There are positive trends. More blacks graduate high school and college. More African Americans, 38% more, graduate from college than 50 years ago. Incomes are up. African American adults have had significant income increase during the past 50 years, more than any other US demographic group. African Americans may live in any community they want. In 1958, 44% of whites said that they would move if a black family became their next door neighbor. Today that figure is 1%. By a wider margin, blacks who consider themselves middle class outnumber those with incomes below the poverty line. Life expectancy for African Americans has increased from 68 to 75. 68, which was in 1976. However, we can ask if the racial profiling and mass incarceration of African Americans is just a modern day form of legal and institutionalized racism. Depending on whom you ask, black people aren't much better off than in 1969, because there is either not enough government help or there is way too much government help. There are still many miles to go on the road to true racial equality. However, it has been suggested that the civil rights community of the 60s failed to anticipate just how tough the voyage would be. Progress can be viewed as an illusion, sort of a fantasy, or a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if blacks and whites understand and celebrate the gains of the past, we will move forward. Progress has been made. Progress, perhaps not as much as many would like. As Martin Luther King said, Lord, we ain't what we ought to be. We ain't what we want to be. We ain't what we gonna be. But thank God, we ain't what we was. Thank you.
Brent McCartney.
In 1969, I was a 14-year-old kid getting ready to move to Portland, Oregon. And so it was in 1970s social studies class that I really started to learn about what had just happened to me over the past, I don't know, 5 years, 6 years, with the war and with the civil rights movement moving forward and freeing more and more people. In 1975, I lost a lot of freedom by breaking my neck. And it was an interesting time. Consciousness of disability was improving, but there was no requirement to do that. So you would find a few restaurants that catered to folks that could get in or had been built that way. But many a restaurant, I entered through the kitchen. And I'll tell you, if you want to lose your appetite, enter through the kitchen. But I was blessed with friends that took me up and down staircases when we needed to, and got the job done when I was going somewhere we were going. It wasn't until the early 90s, thank God, the Americans with Disabilities Act. From that point forward, buildings couldn't be built without a consideration of some kind for the disabled. And there's more and more of that. As the years went by, you get the electronic doors, you get the side ramps, you get an area to go in and there's an elevator right there, as opposed to having to go all the way around the block to get in a ramp or go in a back door. So those with disabilities are very blessed for what our legislature did for the freedom of many people.
Reed Vandenberg, where are you? There.
(1969) was a time of fundamental change within the Episcopal Church. It was tackling head-on issues of racism and social justice. It would be another 7 years before the church would begin ordaining women, but that conversation was also well underway. But let's look at 1969 from the point of view of a transgender parishioner, someone living a more typical experience than those who participated in Stonewall. I'm a storyteller, so let me make up a story for you. Joan is new to town. She finds her closest parish, and as she expects, she's welcomed nicely, and she settles into regular church attendance. The choir director approaches her at one point and asks if she'd like to sing in the choir, but she just laughs him off. She says she can't carry a tune in a bucket, and it wouldn't help her be worshipful to try. He laughs supportively, and he encourages her to sing along the hymns anyway. That's the end of the story. Now, this could be a typical story of someone new coming to St. John's today, but what if I tell you Joan used to be Kevin? That she transitioned a few years before and moved to Portland to start a new life? That her real reason for not joining the choir is her fear that her voice, well controlled when she speaks, would give her away if she sang. No one in her new church has any idea Joan once transitioned, and it would never occur to her to tell anyone. Every use of the name Joan and the pronoun she affirms her identity. Why would she come out? Now flash forward 50 years, 2019. Many who transitioned in 1969 are quite happily living private lives, and they have no desire to come out. So how do you support those who are invisibly already present in our parishes? How do you support those claiming newly emerging non-binary identities, or the longtime parishioner who transitions? There are some practicalities up for discussion, conversations around labeling bathrooms or gendered nomenclature in services and hymnals. There may not be easy or quick solutions, but the main point is taking gender identity seriously enough to have the conversation in the first place. Transgender identity is more visible in the larger culture these days than it was in 1969. And many a trans person is a bit uncomfortable with this, as Joan would be, still preferring a private life. Some may feel gratified to hear their parish addressing such issues, and they may come out in order to be of service. Hearing their issues taken seriously affirms the journey they had to go on to become their true selves. Knowing that the bishop led the Episcopal contingent in the Pride Parade enhances a feeling of being safely home in their church. And these days, some who transition never did desire privacy, affirming, yes, my name is Reed, and I was given the name Nancy at birth. My trans identity has given me a deeper understanding of gender, a gift I share with others in service of creating community. If I don't come out, how can I properly use this gift God has given me? The church has expanded in the past 50 years, giving me the gift of being able to stand before you in authenticity, an opportunity not available to transgender people of 50 years ago. Thank you.
So, a lot has happened in 50 years. The moral arc has begun to bend, but we ain't there yet. And it is a constant battle, a constant involvement. We actually risk spiritual danger if we just relax that we have female clergy, LGBTQ clergy, that we have a black presiding bishop, that we have ramps to get to the church and the altar, that we have unisex bathrooms. That's the first step. And this was the mission of our patron, John, is to make those mountains small and the valleys to be lifted up, so that everyone has a road to the realm of God, that everyone has access to a place at the table, and that we can all sit side by side, not tolerating our differences, but rejoicing in them. And in that moment, we can let the sun shine in. We can stop playing the games that people play now, but put a little love in our heart, and we can help carry one another, knowing that no one's heavy. They're our sibling. And when we get to that day, we can wake up and truly sing, "Oh, happy day." Amen.
Amen.